The glass tower of Sterling Heights shimmered under the torrential rain, a monolith of cold steel and colder hearts. I stood in the lobby, the weight of a cardboard box in my arms and the heavier weight of my 5-year-old daughter, Lily, clinging to my hip. Her small, damp hand was pressed against my chest, her heartbeat a rhythmic reminder of why I'd endured Julian's ego for 5 years. Julian stepped out of the private elevator, his silk tie perfectly knotted, his eyes devoid of the history we shared, the late nights, the saved deals, the scandals I'd buried. He didn't look at the box, and he certainly didn't look at the shivering child in my arms. He simply flicked a gold-embossed envelope onto the marble counter. "It's a severance package, Elena. Generous, considering your focus has been elsewhere lately." He glanced at Lily as if she were a smudge on his window. A CEO needs a partner whose vision isn't clouded by nursery rhymes and fever chills. You're a brilliant architect of strategy, but you've become a liability. Go be a full-time mother, you're clearly better at changing diapers than changing the world. The lobby echoed with the sharp click of his heels as he turned away. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I simply adjusted my grip on Lily, her breath warm against my neck, and walked into the rain. He thought he was discarding a tool, but as I looked back at the glowing logo of his empire, I knew the truth. He hadn't just fired his assistant. He had just evicted the only person who knew where the foundation was rotting. The 2-room cottage smelled of damp cedar and the metallic tang of old pipes. It was a skeletal remains of a life, located so far from the city's pulse that the silence felt like a physical weight. I sat at the scarred wooden table, my fingers tracing the frayed hem of my only professional coat, while Lily slept fitfully on a moth-eaten sofa nearby. The generous severance Julian had boasted about had vanished into a black hole of overdue medical bills and a security deposit for this drafty sanctuary. Outside, the rain turned the yard into a graveyard of mud, mirroring the slow decay of my bank account. I stared at a pile of utility bills, the red overdue stamps glowing like warning lights in the dim glow of a single flickering bulb. For weeks, we survived on boxed mac and cheese and the dwindling hope that Julian's blacklist hadn't reached every firm in the tri-state area. It had. Each rejection email was a jagged blade, cutting deeper into the pride I had spent a decade building. I reached for the cold tea at the edge of the table, my hand trembling as I realized I was down to my last $50. I was at my breaking point, a silent sob racking my chest, when I felt a soft warmth against my shoulder. I turned to find Lily standing there, her eyes wide and knowing. She didn't ask for a toy or a treat, she simply pressed her small palm against my heart, anchoring me to the earth. In that moment of absolute poverty, I realized Julian hadn't just taken my job, illegally, he had tried to take my dignity. But looking at Lily, I knew the frayed hem of our lives was just the beginning of a much tighter knot. The roar of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet of the valley, a sound that didn't belong among the rustling pines and creaking floorboards. I stood on the porch, watching as Julian's silver Maybach crawled up the gravel driveway like a sleek, predatory shark out of water. When he stepped out, the crisp mountain air seemed to wilt. His tailored suit was wrinkled, his hair, usually a masterpiece of corporate precision, was disheveled, and his eyes held the frantic, hollow look of a man watching his empire turn to ash. "Elena," he began, his voice stripped of its usual iron authority. He didn't look at the peeling paint of the cottage, or the broken swing set in the yard. He looked at me with a desperation that was almost pathetic. "The board is calling for a forensic audit. The offshore mergers, the ones you structured in 22. There's a discrepancy. A $50 million ghost that only you can find." He pulled a checkbook from his breast pocket, his hands trembling as he uncapped a gold pen. "Name your price. $1 million signing bonus. A partner's desk. Just come back and fix it before this sec freezes everything. I looked down at Lily, who was sitting at my feet, carefully mending a torn doll with a piece of string. She didn't even look up at the man, who had once called her a liability. I turned back to Julian, feeling the weight of the disposal fee he'd once tossed at me. You told me a CEO needs a partner without a clouded vision, Julian, I said, my voice as cold and steady as the mountain stream. My vision has never been clearer. I'm not a mechanic for a car that's already been totaled. The answer is no. Julian didn't leave. He stood by his idling car, his face contorting from desperation to a jagged, ugly sneer. You're being short-sighted, Elena. That audit will drag everyone down, including you. You signed the NDA. You signed the intellectual property waivers. Everything you built in that office belongs to me. If I go down, I'll make sure you and that child are left with nothing but the dirt on this porch. I leaned against the doorframe, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. It was the look of a hunter who had watched the trap snap shut months ago. That's the thing about treating people like tools, Julian, you never bother to check the serial numbers. I pulled a single, laminated document from my folder. The patents for the core algorithm. The ones that anchor your entire $50 million valuation. I didn't register them to the company. I registered them to a private educational trust one established 5 years ago. I stepped down the porch stairs, my eyes locking onto his. According to the filings you signed without reading, while you were busy texting your influencer friends, those patents are owned by Lily. You've been using her intellectual property for 18 months without a licensing agreement. Julian's face went a ghostly shade of grey. The liability he had mocked was now his landlord. You're trespassing on a 5-year-old's estate, Julian. And as for that void NDA, you testified in your divorce court that I was a low-value secretary with no access to trade secrets. You can't claim I'm a threat now without admitting you committed perjury then. That was the bait. And you swallowed it whole. The courtroom was a tomb of mahogany and silenced ambitions. Julian sat at the defense table, his $4,000 suit hanging off his frame like a shroud. Beside him, his socialite fiancée was no longer taking selfies. She was frantically checking her bank balance on a phone that would soon be disconnected. When the judge's gavel struck the bench, it sounded like the final nail in a coffin I had spent 6 months crafting. The licensing fees alone exceed the liquid assets of the corporation, the judge announced, her voice echoing with the finality of a death sentence. Julian didn't look at me as the bailiffs approached. He looked at the floor, finally realizing that the diaper-changing mother had quietly dismantled his world while he was busy admiring his own reflection. His empire was no longer his, it was a settled debt, transferred in its entirety to the trust one managed for Lily. We walked out of the courthouse into the crisp autumn air, leaving the wreckage of Julian's ego behind. A week later, I didn't return to the CEO's office. Instead, I sold the glass tower to a non-profit and moved our operations to a sun-drenched studio where the only priorities were integrity and growth. As I watched Lily running through a field of gold-leafed trees, her laughter untainted by the shadow of a corporate lobby, I realized I hadn't just secured her future. I had reclaimed my own. Justice wasn't a paycheck. It was the freedom to build a life where the foundations were finally made of something stronger than glass.